I have my filter, I have my outer layer, and I have my lining. And you'll notice the lining layer is actually about a ½ an inch shorter than the outside layer, and that will make sense when we put this together later. Okay, so now we are ready to start sewing, and we're going to start sewing by seaming the long curved layers of each set of layers of our mask. So both the lining and the outer layer, as well as our filter layer. Okay, so I'm going to start by seaming the long curved layer of each layer of my mask. So the filter, the outer layer, and the lining layer, all with right sides together, so wrong sides out. For the filter, it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this curve, and for both the outer layer and the lining, it's ½ an inch. So you'll start by sewing those curves. Okay, so once you have your filter layer seamed down the long curve, you're actually going to put this aside for now. We're going to come back to it later. And right now we're just going to deal with our lining layer and our outer layer. So for both our lining layer and our outer layer, we're actually going to open up and split apart our layers so that the seam is facing up towards us. And I like to do this from the right side, but what you're going to do now is push all of the seam allowance over to one side of the seam, and you're going to top stitch about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from your original seam line down that curve. And you're going to do that for both the lining layer and the outside layer. So what you should have now is a top stitch seam going down the long curve of both the lining layer and your outer layer. So both will be finished this way. And you're stitching that seam allowance pushed to one side through all the layers, so that on the outside, it's basically a nice flattened curved seam. Okay, so both the outside layer and our lining layer are going to have hemmed edges along the short sides of each side of your mask. So you'll be doing 4 hems, one on each short flat edge of both the outside and the lining layers. So for that, we're going to do a 1/2 inch turn and turn. So what I like to do to go ahead and start that is actually use my ruler to mark where that ½ inch is in my fabric, and make a little snip at both the top and the bottom. And you can use smaller scissors for this. These are just what I have on hand. And what I'm doing is folding where those little snips are to remind me of where a ½ inch is, and then I'll be folding it the same amount again. So you're going to go ahead and do that with your iron. Okay, so now you have your finished hemmed edges pre-pressed, ready to go when we bring them back to the sewing machine. But quickly before we go back to the sewing machine, I'm going to show how we finish off the filter that goes inside the mask. Okay, so right now I'm going to show you how we finish off the edges of our pre-seamed filter. So for me, I have a serger, so that's what I'll use to finish mine off. However, if you don't have a serger, you can pink the raw edges with a pair of pinking shears. You can also do a zigzag stitch along the edge with your zigzag stitch just going over the edge of the raw seam there, and it will finish the edges for you. However, if you do have a serger, it's super helpful because it's very quick. So I'm going to go ahead and serge the seam of my filter, and then I'm also going to serge all the raw edges around the edge of my filter as well. Okay, so now I have a filter that has been fully clean finished all around the edges and seamed down that curved seam with a serged edge to finish it off. The last step that I'm going to do with my filter is actually at the sewing machine, so we're going to head back over there to finish this off. Okay, so we're back at the sewing machine, and I'm going to start by finishing off my filter. So how I'm going to finish it off is the same way that I finished off my first 2 layers of the lining and outer layer, where I top stitched through that seam allowance. I'm going to do the exact same thing to just kind of add some extra strength to that seam going down the center front of my mask. And there you have it. That's your finished filter, and again, you can just place the filter aside while you move on to constructing the rest of your mask. So for the lining, you're going to go ahead and finish off that hem by edge stitching down your double folded edge on each side. So you're only going to do this in the lining layer, and then you're going to move on to connecting your outer layer to your lining layer. So at this point, you've now hemmed the edges of your lining. So just those short pre-pressed edges. And you're not going to hem or finish stitching the hem on your outer layer of your mask yet. You're actually going to seam both of these layers together almost like a tube, and then you're going to finish the edges on the outside of the mask. So you want to put both your seamed pieces right sides together, and you want to make sure that the top of your seam and the bottom of your seam going down the center are matching on each mask, and that's how you'll keep these in the right position. So I'm making sure it's the same on both sides, and wherever this edge falls over here, I'm just lining it up. And then I'm putting it under my foot, and I will seam the seam across the top edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I will do the same on the bottom edge, again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Alright, so at this point you have seamed across the top of your mask from one end of your hemmed edge of your lining to the other, and you're doing the same on the bottom, but you'll notice there's a slight curve in both the top and the bottom that when we turn this right side out is going to be a little bit hard to lay flat. So what I do is I do actually clip along the seam up to the stitch line through all the layers about 1 inch to 3/4 inch apart, just making sure to release all that tension that comes from the seam allowance lying on that curve when we flip it inside out. So I go ahead and do that on the top edge, and I repeat it on the bottom edge. So my mask is fully flipped, and you'll notice that the short side on the back here is where the layer exists in my lining for a pocket for my filter. Now the outside layer, if we flip it that way, is longer, and that one is pre-pressed, ready to be hemmed, so you can go ahead and do the hem on that edge now. And then we'll insert both our filter and our nose piece. So first things we're going to do is finish off the edge over here. You want to make sure that you leave your seam allowance folded in, that's coming out from the top and bottom edges, and then you're folding over your hem to that pre-pressed amount that you already pressed with your iron. So it should fold pretty much right to where your pocket begins, either butted up right against it or just outside of it. And then you're going to edge stitch down that hem to finish off each side of the outside layer of your mask. So I now have each of my outside layer edges finished, and you can see this now presents a pocket or a layer for my filter to sit in between the outside layer of my mask and the inside layer, and it's looking pretty good. You might. The next thing I want to do now is insert my nose piece that goes across the top here. So your nose piece should be about 2 inches from here to here, basically 1 inch away from either side of the center curve at the top of your mask. Now the top is the one with the much more severe curve going over the top. The more flatter curve at the bottom sits under your chin. So this high curve up here is what sits over the bridge of your nose. So we're going to take the filter, and how I like to do it is insert my filter up into where it's going to sit and top stitch underneath it, forming a nice tight bond between the two fabrics to hold it in place with friction. Okay, so once you have your nose piece in there, it's going to sit pretty flat, and it's going to do something a little bit weird until you bend it into the shape of your nose. So once it's in, and you can always take it out by flattening out the wire and sliding it out in between the pocket layer, especially if you're going to clean it and you're worried about the wire getting rusted or anything like that. When you're cleaning it, or if you're boiling it to sanitize it, you might want to take it out, especially if it's coated. So make sure that you just bend it into the shape of your nose on a curve like that, and it'll actually hold tight to your nose when you're wearing it. And this is especially good if you're someone who wears glasses and you're worried about your glasses fogging up. Having a nose piece to hold the mask right to your face will stop that fogging from happening, because it'll be nice and tight to your nose. So now I'm ready to insert my filter. So you can just go ahead and, using your hand, push that filter layer right in between the top and bottom layer. What you might notice is, depending on the width of your nose piece, if it's a little bit wider, a little bit thinner, it might mean that you have to trim the top edge of your filter, which you can do, and that's okay, just so long as it fits nice and flush in between all the seams. So I'll go ahead and insert mine now. So, as you can see, my filter is now sitting snug in between the layers. A little bit of bubbling happening, and you can smooth that out with your fingers, or once you put it on, it tends to smooth itself out as well. And now we're ready to channel our elastic or our cotton ribbon, whatever you're preferring to use as ties, through each side of the outer layer of our mask, and that's how we're going to get it to fit onto a face. So for me, when I make masks and I'm donating, I like to channel in the elastic through each side, and I leave the ends long, and I also leave them just cut. The person who this is donated to might have a different head size than me, or might want to tie it behind their ears or all the way around the back of their head. Depends how they prefer to wear their mask. So I like to leave just 2 lengths coming from the top and the bottom through these channeled seams, and they can choose the length of which they're comfortable wearing the mask. And there you have it. That is a finished, ready to donate mask. Its filter is inside. It has a flexible nose piece to adjust for the wearer, and these strings can be tied as tightly as needed to fit either around the back of the head or behind the ears, depending on the shape of the wearer's face and how big their head is, and they can adjust that as necessary. So now you're ready to make your own mask.